Today is the 24th of January, 2017. The topic is the use of lies by diplomats, Henry Kissinger, and by the Trump administration. This is called Athens Speakout, number 395. And Dave DeWitt and I are going to be our own moderators, and we'll try and keep time of allowing 10 minutes each and then interrupt and go to the other guy. Anyway, I'm going to start off with the introduction. Last week, Dave DeWitt of the Athens News and I had a disagreement about the kinds of lies a professional diplomat uses in the conduct of foreign policy compared to the use of lies of a king, chief of state, president, or prime minister who tells his legislative leaders and the voting public what the president and his secretary of state want to do. So the moderator would ask Dave DeWitt to comment on, the first question would be, what is your argument and the thesis about the article written by Greg Grandin that Trump lies are no better nor worse than Henry Kissinger's diplomacy from 1968 to 1974. So you're on the stage now.
Well, I think the article referenced in The Nation by Greg, what's his name? Grandin. Grandin, right. Greg Grandin. In The Nation. Oh boy, lost my microphone there.
Okay.
Here we go. The argument that he made in that article was that Henry Kissinger's policy of creating confusion with an unpredictable actor might be useful as Kissinger advises President Trump. My thesis about that article is that Kissinger's technique of unpredictability only works when there is an underlying coherent foreign policy strategy that's being pursued through the use of that unpredictability. President Trump's unpredictability arises, in my opinion, not out of strategy, but out of impulsiveness on his part, and is therefore not a diplomatic tool, but what I would consider a clear and present danger to the balance of power throughout the world.
Well, I think that I agree with everything you said today, but Grandin explains that Kissinger is talking to China's General Secretary of the Communist Party right now, Xi Jinping, and he's giving Trump a chance to develop a rational policy toward China, and Kissinger thinks that he can help get Kissinger focused on his old balance of power politics. That remains to be seen. So I started out with a great faith in Kissinger, and you, 2 or 3 weeks ago, denounced Kissinger for his military behavior in Vietnam and in Chile and other countries, and atrocities.
South Africa.
And
South America.
And
yeah.
I don't think that you completely understood the theories of the balance and the practice of the balance of power. And maybe Grandin has convinced you of a new Kissinger. Would you say that's a fair compromise?
Well, Grandin is a Kissinger critic, like me. He wrote a book called Kissinger's Shadow, where he takes exception, as I do, to Kissinger's what I would call war crimes in Cambodia and Laos and East Timor and South Africa, South America. And so the thing that, what What Grandin did convince me of in his Nation article is that Henry Kissinger is trying to influence the Trump administration in his own style.
Right.
What I am unconvinced of from Grandin's article is that Grandin seemed to imply, at least, that Kissinger would be successful in influencing the Trump administration. And I'm not so sure that President Trump will pay Henry Kissinger the deference that perhaps Kissinger or even Mr. Grandin might expect.
Yeah, well, I think I would agree with you. Nobody knows what Trump will do. So I guess my comments about Kissinger and Bismarck and the balance of power and the seesaw and so forth are somewhat agreed to by now, and that you do think that Kissinger and Bismarck and John Quincy Adams were all great diplomats who knew how to use the balance of power, and most of the administrations, both Democrats and Republicans, have too much ideology and don't really understand what Kissinger was trying to do. And Kissinger pulled off his withdrawal of Vietnam under the cover of propaganda. In other words, when Kissinger was the secretary, it was the national security advisor for Nixon, it was a disguised retreat. And he was telling everybody, yeah, you got to keep fighting the war. But that was propaganda for the benefit of the Republican Party and propaganda for the press to keep Nixon in office. Mm-hmm. But eventually, Nixon and Kissinger agreed, well, you got to get out of Indochina because that's driving Beijing and Moscow together. Once you get out, Kissinger could go to Beijing and make a diplomatic ploy and then go to Moscow and make a different diplomatic ploy. And he could split the two communist parties and they could resolve their differences at the UN through peaceful negotiations.
Yeah. Well, I agree with most of that.
Okay.
I would definitely call John Quincy Adams and Otto von Bismarck great diplomats. I wouldn't use the same term for Henry Kissinger. An effective diplomat, maybe, is what I would call Henry Kissinger. I don't have any admiration for him. With regard to Vietnam, I think his undermining of the 1968 Paris peace talks needlessly prolonged the Vietnam War for 5 more years and cost at least 30,000 more American lives and millions in Indochina.
As a Democrat, I would say Kissinger had a good strategy, but I still voted for the Democrats.
You're for peace.
Yeah, I'm for peace. And I'm for peace. But in the long run of history, Kissinger was a better foreign policy advisor than the Democratic secretaries of state. I mean, who have we had?
I think he was effective. I think he was enormously effective in what he was doing.
He was not an anti-communist ideologue.
He was never an ideologue. Right. He was a very, very real politic.
Right, and he got Nixon slowly to give up the one China policy and admit, well, we're going to have negotiations. And of course, they were secretly carried out.
Right.
And both Nixon and Kissinger betrayed the South Vietnamese government, and Nixon didn't get the blame, and Win Cao Ki and Win Van Tu didn't blame. They blamed Kissinger for the sellout, not Nixon. But then when they fled, it didn't make any difference anyway.
Right.
And of course, Jerry Ford took the rap for being president in 1975 when the United States government had to say, we've lost, we're out of Vietnam. But nobody blamed Ford. Ford was just inherited a flawed foreign policy that continued from Johnson through Nixon, and Kissinger did a pretty good job in getting us out of the war, but it did take too long. So
Yeah.
I don't regard him as a good Democrat or as a hero, or he's got stains on his reputation. But so did Bismarck.
Yeah.
Bismarck united Germany in 3 short wars. The Prussian-Danish War.
Bismarck used
He
war
used
as
war to get his way, but they were short wars.
Right.
That's the difference between Kissinger and Bismarck. Bismarck had 3 short wars to unite Germany, and the Emperor Napoleon III defeated himself.
Mm-hmm.
So Bismarck used military means, yes, but it was only a 3-month war, the Franco-Prussian War. And in Austria, it was a 7-week war. And with Schleswig-Holstein, it was a 2-week war, a 2-day war.
And I think it would also be fair to say that those wars didn't result in mass casualties of innocent civilians.
That's right. Yeah, but
Which
you
we
see,
saw in
but
the
you see,
20th century.
Kissinger inherited the war from LBJ, and he inherited that anti-communist policy from the Korean War, and there was never an ideology. Well, there was a democratic ideology in Bismarck's day, but that was underground.
It wasn't very popular either. I mean,
No,
George
it had
McGovern.
nothing to do with popularity. In Bismarck's day, you had the Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Habsburgs in Austria, the Tsar in Russia. He was dealing with all monarchs.
Right. And this
And-
was a true balance of power in the 19th century.
It was a balance of power of the monarchs.
Right.
And he didn't have to deal with democratic public opinion. Now, the British and the Americans were democracies. So, democracies are inherently contradictory to ruthless balance of power politics. And that was a contradiction which the United States hasn't faced yet.
Well, yeah, because there's...
We still like to call ourselves democratic,
Right.
but democracy is getting weaker,
The republic hasn't fallen yet.
and power politics is getting more powerful.
We have just installed an authoritarian as president of the United States.
Hopefully he will only last 2 years, maybe he'll last 4 years, and hopefully the Democrats can make a comeback. And that's why I believe that foreign policy is an interplay between military factors, political factors,
Right, you're split.
economic factors, and you have to have a religion, an ideology, or a philosophy to have a civilized domestic civilization. So civilization in America, whether it's Jewish or Christian, is on trial. Is the United States going to keep a civilization, or is it going to retreat to pure barbarism? Because as the United States government fought in Indochina, and as they fight in the Middle East, the American troops get more barbaric, and they inherit the barbarism of the enemy. I mean, that's what the Viet Cong did to the American troops.
Oh, I know.
They were, and what are they doing in Abu Ghraib? They're using Muslim tactics,
Right.
torture and secrecy, and so I don't know what Trump is going to do. I don't know where his moral base is, and nobody else
Well,
does.
he's appointed a
Right.
CIA director now who has
We don't know what
condoned the use of torture in the past,
Well,
which
that's-
doesn't bode well.
That doesn't bode well.
Unfortunately, he was approved by 65 U.S. senators
It has
today,
been approved. Well, that's no news.
including 14 Democrats.
Yeah,
But
well, that's bad
that
news.
51 Republicans, 14 Democrats.
Oh, that's no news.
Yeah, that was
And
just
it's
today.
sad news.
Yeah. Pompeo is his name.
Yeah,
There was
I-
one Republican who voted against him. That was Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky.
Well, he's got some kind of a democratic sentiment.
He's a libertarian, so he does not like foreign
Well,
interventionism.
his father was a real dove, you know.
Yeah.
He ran in a third party.
Also doesn't like foreign interventionism.
Yeah, because they're drafting Kentucky hillbillies to fight in these wars.
Yeah. The Paul family are essentially, I mean, isolationists, essentially is what you would call them, or you could just say that they are not in favor of they want to scale back
Right.
America's military adventures throughout
Okay.
the world.
Well, let's see if we have anything.
Would you like me to get to your question?
Well, let me see where we are here. I think we've covered the Kissingers and the balance of power and the seesaw. And all right, so the question to me was, do you have any further comments on Trump's lack of experience on the foreign policy?
Right.
And I would say Trump's pick for the CIA, Mike Pompeo, and you've just clarified that, is bad news.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know much about the National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. I think he's ill-informed.
He is a
and he
zealot.
doesn't know whether he wants to go to war against Russia in the Middle East.
He is a zealot.
He hasn't got any strategy.
As far as I can tell, no. From the history that I've been able to gather about Michael Flynn, he seems to be to have some fairly radical ideas. He has connections to Russia that are currently under investigation right now by multiple intelligence agencies. And he is a zealot. He is not. He seems to be an ideologue to me, which is not necessarily a good thing for somebody in such a sensitive role as NSA advisor.
That's been the weakness of American foreign policy, starting with Truman, getting a little worse under Eisenhower, and then worse under Lyndon Johnson. Now, Kennedy started out as a hawk, but in his last couple of months, August 1963, he suddenly discovered that he was a dove and agreed with Macmillan to sign the Nuclear Atmosphere Test Ban Treaty.
Right.
And the Republicans, they were going to, I don't know whether they were behind the assassination of Kennedy or not. They thought war was the only answer.
Yeah.
And they were unanimously against. In other words, Kennedy did that on his own, and he gave it in a speech.
Yeah.
And once it was out in the speech, the media picked it up. And what could the CIA and the Defense Department say?
Right.
They had to be quiet.
And I think that Kennedy had some bad experiences with the CIA, the bad pigs.
Right.
And I think that he probably learned from those experiences and wanted
and then
to
he
take
made
more cautious.
a secret conversation to his national security officer. Well, after I go to Dallas and after I win, I'm going to think about getting out of Vietnam. Well, that's another mystery. Would Kennedy have carried out that promise? And was the assassination stimulated by that insecurity on the part of the CIA that John Kennedy was a flake?
I'm sure there are a lot of people that, I mean, we'll never know, to be quite honest.
Well, we'll know once the archives are released.
Yeah, and we know more after the 50-year timeline passed.
Right.
More stuff was released, and in another 50 years, more stuff will be released. But
okay, do you want to say anything about the military action in Russia-Ukrainian regional disputes?
Well,
do you want to keep out of the Russian affairs, or do you want to get involved?
You mean in our conversation here?
You and I.
Yeah, no, let's get into it, because I think that it's a touch point where it's fraught with danger right now. I think that Mr. Putin has made himself fairly clear in his desire to reestablish some of Russia's grandeur in its borders.
That's right.
I would argue, in fact, going back to imperialist Russia, seem to be, to me, the borders that he would ideally draw for his country if he could. I think that in the past, 6 years, we've seen him invade Georgia, and we've seen him take over Crimea and destabilize the Ukraine.
No, I don't know what you mean by destabilize.
Well, his troops that he sent into the Ukraine during the crisis in Kiev. Kiev. And
Kiev is a Ukrainian pronunciation. Kiev was the classical Russian pronunciation.
Okay. Well,
just changing that spelling is part of the problem.
He sent his troops, people.
He sent his troops into Crimea. He sent his troops into Crimea.
But also into the Ukraine wearing different uniforms, and they denied that they were Russian troops.
All right, okay. In the Ukraine, he had nationalism. The Russians had nationalism on their side.
Yeah.
Because the Ukraine was conquered by Catherine the Great.
Right.
And was 98% Russian. Very few Ukrainians ever lived there. Now, if you look at
And
the
then Crimea.
if you look at the Ukraine, it's divided by the Dnieper River, and the early capital of the tribe called the Rus was established at Kiev because it was far south, and these Vikings were trying to get down to Byzantium and raid the Roman Empire. So in 988, Vladimir I, who called himself a Rus, and that was his language, Rus, he declared himself Vladimir I, Russian king or Russian prince, okay?
Right.
And the only difference between the Pole and the Russian was religion. Their language was originally a kind of Old Slavic. So 22 years before, in 966, King Mieszko I on the Vistula River said, I'm a Roman Catholic, and this is Poland. Okay. The Ukraine was Russian, no problem then, in 988. But in 1258, the Mongols.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the time of Genghis Khan.
No, well, it was the grandsons of Genghis Khan.
Okay, yeah.
They started out Mongolia, and they conquered China. They tried to conquer Japan, they gave it up. They conquered India and established the Mughal dynasty.
Not to mention a lot of Mesopotamia.
Then they came down to Kiev, and they said, we ask you to surrender. And if you don't surrender, we're going to come back in 40 days, and we'll kill every man, woman, and child in this region. And they did.
Yeah.
They wiped
That's
Kiev
what
out.
they did, yeah.
And the few remaining Russians there fled to the north, went up to what's now called Moscow. And that's woodland and cold. And the Mongols didn't want to go up there. They wanted to stay down in the steppe.
Right, the
grassland.
steppe people, yeah.
Yeah. So they set up an empire called the Golden Horde. That was the name of their empire. By that time, they had converted to Islam. So the great Khan had his little capital down there. And he ruled over this territory called the Ukraine. And they didn't, I don't think they had the name Ukraine. They just called it the steppe, okay? Now there is a group called the Tatars. The Tatars are Muslims who live in that region and still speak some kind of an Islamic dialect, okay? Well, anyway, the Golden Horde finally decayed and disintegrated. Moscow, meanwhile, was taking cities in the north and set up a new state called Muscovy. Okay? And that's how the Tsars got started. The Tsars were the first ones to have the authority to go down to the Golden Horde. Well, we're no longer going to collect the taxes for you. We're going to call ourselves an independent Muscovy state. And then they gradually moved south. And then Ivan the Terrible, okay? He was the fourth of the Tsars, okay? The first Ivan. So they were reconquering what they called the Russian state. Now, while the Mongols had taken this over, the Poles were expanding. So in 1643, I think, the Poles conquered what's called Kiev because Moscow was still up there. And half of Ukraine was annexed by Poland. And they began to make converts to the Catholic Church. And they set up a new religion called the Unat Church. That is, they spoke a Russian, Ukrainian, Slavic dialect and used Cyrillic alphabet, but they gave their loyalty to the Pope in Rome.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the Ukraine was divided into religious, a kind of a Catholic West and an Orthodox East. So it's a mixed population. So anyway, Catherine the Great comes down from the north.
This is in the 19th century.
Yeah, no, earlier. Peter the Great.
Peter the Great, okay.
Peter the Great he knocks Sweden out. And he beats the Swedes down in the Ukraine, the Great Northern Battle, 1741 or something. And then he comes down and he conquers the Ukraine, and he goes all the way, and then Catherine the Great continues that and goes all the way down to the Black Sea and conquers an empty territory called the Crimea because it was a peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mongols never bothered with that. It wasn't steppe, it was kind of tropical.
Mm-hmm.
So the Crimea became almost 100% Russian speaking. Well, then the Poles and the Russians kept fighting back and forth. What is the Ukraine? Now, the word Ukraine, if I understand it correctly, is the Russian word for a lost province, a kind of a territory, a kind of a no man's land. So the Ukrainian dialect is very close to the Russian dialect. It's like Portuguese and Spanish. Every Portuguese can automatically understand Spanish. Every Ukrainian can automatically understand Russian. Kiev, well,
Right.
that's just a matter of playing around with syllables. So, when Stalin got in there, well, after the Tsars, they didn't bother with the Ukraine. It was just they didn't
Well, at the end of the empire, Ukraine was
which empire? The
the
Tsars?
Tsars. Yeah, the
All right,
Tsarist empire.
Tsarnik-
Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And it was called the Ukraine as a territory.
Right.
It's like
Not as an independent state.
yeah, it was sort of like the Ohio Territory after the United States was founded. Mm-hmm. Okay, it was a wild country, or like Kansas, a territory of the Ukraine. So then, when the Bolsheviks came in, Lenin sets up
1917.
Lenin sets up the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So there's a Russian Soviet Republic.
Right.
There is a
USSR.
Ukrainian Soviet Republic. There's a Georgian Soviet, and they had 16 states.
And so on, right.
And they believed in national independence, but it was a fraud because the party was centralized. So the real ruler was the Communist Party of Russia. Mm-hmm. They were the senior party. Now, Khrushchev himself was a Ukrainian, but he was in the Politburo, and Stalin sent him down to be the Tsar or be the commissar for Stalin, okay?
Yeah.
So anyway, it was actually Franklin Roosevelt at the UN that reestablished the idea of a Ukrainian state.
Mm-hmm.
Because when they set up the UN, Stalin was very, very dubious about getting into the UN. He said, well, I'll always be outvoted. The British Commonwealth has 15, 20 members. They got 20, 15 votes. And you Americans have all of Latin America. You have another 20 votes.
So this is where they came up with the veto powers?
Well, Roosevelt said, well, you have the veto in the Security Council. Well,
Yeah.
he says, I want more power in the General Assembly. So Roosevelt, in order just to be a compromiser, said, okay, we can set up 3 states, the Russian Republic, the Ukrainian Republic, and the White Russians or the Belarus Republic. Mm-hmm. And you can have 3 seats. Well, of course, they were satellites. They didn't mean anything. So anyway, Soviet Union collapsed. And in 1991, Yeltsin just said, okay, there is no more Soviet Union. So then you had 16 independent republics. Mm-hmm. And Ukraine has its independence. Georgia has its independence.
The Baltic states.
The Baltic Sea. Now, the White Russians, the Belarus, are so weak that they are still a satellite of Russia because they don't have the economic base. Now, the Ukraine is a little stronger than the White Russians, but they raise wheat, but they're dependent on Russia for import of oil. So economically, Russia still has its hooks on the Ukraine.
Yeah. I think we should take a station break
right.
right now. I'm David DeWitt. I'm here with Professor Robert Whaley. We're discussing the history of the Russian Empire and the USSR.
Right, and what the new Russia was. And I don't think that, I think that Putin would like to.
Would you agree with me that he's got an expansionist agenda for the borders geographically of Russia?
He has the power, he has the economic power with his oil and gas to play politics with Germany and with the Ukraine. Now, the Germans would like to buy Soviet gas and oil as an alternative to the Middle East. So the Americans and Germans are getting to be a little rival. Right? So Andrea Merkel.
Yeah, Angela Merkel. Right.
Is not cool. Is cool toward getting into any war over the Ukraine.
Right.
So that's what Kerry and Obama were doing. They were treading water.
Yeah, they were trying to run out the clock on this stuff for their administration. Now, what do you make of the other states, such as the Baltic states or Poland, for instance?
Well, I think Poland has its independence.
And Poland seems to have some military capabilities.
And they've already joined the Western Bloc.
Right.
NATO has guaranteed Poland. And
Now,
Germany will fight for Poland.
Right, and that brings up NATO, which President Trump has repeatedly disparaged.
Yeah, and that's stupid.
I agree.
That is stupid.
That would seem to me to destabilize some of this delicate balance in that region. Do you think that?
I don't think Trump has an idea of what he wants to do. But now he's listening.
So he's disparaged NATO,
right?
But that hasn't translated so far into any sort of tangible, actual policy on NATO. He hasn't implemented anything with regard to the United States.
Yeah,
we
don't know.
Pulled out of NATO.
We have to see more about Flynn and Tillerson, what they will do in Pompeo. I don't know what they'll do.
Yeah.
But I think they're as confused as I think they are lower echelon bureaucrats who a little bit suspicious of the military are suspicious of the State Department.
Right.
And the State Department and the military are suspicious of Democratic presidents, okay? So the State Department tends to be Democratic. The Defense Department tends to be Republican. So this is a lot of backbiting underground among bureaucrats.
But President Trump is no traditional Republican.
He's a real estate dealer.
Yeah. So it's kind of a wild card.
It's a wild card.
It would seem to me like both departments
I have no idea what he will do.
Yeah.
And you don't either.
No, I certainly don't.
And I think it's bad news that the Democrats could only come up with. How many votes were there for Tillerson? He was just confirmed?
Yeah, he was just confirmed.
What was the vote again?
I don't know. I would have to. I can look it up.
You just told me. You could just have the.
Oh, Pompeo.
Pompeo. Yeah,
the vote for Pompeo was 65 to 35.
Okay. Well, that's a bad trend. Now, Tillerson hasn't been confirmed yet.
I think he was just confirmed today, actually.
But you don't have the numbers.
I don't have the numbers.
Okay.
No.
Well, we have to.
Or at least no, he was confirmed in the committee today.
In the committee.
Right.
Okay. Well, the Democrats are on the defensive, and democracy's on the defensive, and you and I are on the defensive, and Trump's got the. He's got the nomination. So I say, all I can do is wait 100 days.
Yeah.
Be silent, and collect that information and facts, and then after the 100 days, we can start criticizing these administrators as
it's admirable of you to wait that 100 days. I
don't have any power. You're a journalist. You have to get into it.
I've launched into it myself already.
Yeah, okay.
Mostly on domestic stuff, though. Foreign policy, I'm still at a loss. I have no idea what his administration is going to do.
Neither do I.
So far, they haven't made any concrete
I have
moves.
hope that he listens to Kissinger. That was the point of this article by The Nation.
Garden, yeah.
Yeah.
Greg Garden.
And there was another article in the Post by Elliot Lake, Washington Post, thinks that it seems that Kissinger has restored the State Department to its position of strength that it had back in 1975.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That's at the end of the Ford administration. And Kissinger ran for the Ford's foreign policy. Okay? Now, Carter goes off on a new tangent. He was overconfident that he could make a peace compromise in Israel. Now, Israel is a problem now for the Democrats.
Well, so far, Netanyahu and Trump are cozying up to each other.
So far.
But Trump is also threatening, I think, to destabilize the entire peace process, but whatever exists of it currently, that Netanyahu hasn't already destroyed, by threatening to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem.
I was gratified by a new signature in Kazakhstan, in which Turkey and Russia and Iran imposes a peace on Athens against originally the American intervention.
Yeah.
And the Americans say, we support that. They're not going to buck it. So this is already a gesture that the Trump administration, maybe under the direction of Kissinger, does not want to have war with Russia and the Middle East, two wars at the same time.
No, I don't think.
Okay.
I think that I think the Trump administration so far has signaled a willingness to work with Russia,
right,
and with the Assad regime to combat ISIS. Now, how that plays into them cozying up with Netanyahu, and they, for instance, they want to get rid of the Iran deal. Now, that's not something that's going to be taken nicely by Iran and Russia.
Well, Iran was endorsed by a six-power agreement.
Right.
Now, secretly in the closet, the big opponent to that deal are Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer.
Schumer, yeah.
Yeah.
There are some Democrats like Schumer in the Israel
who will
lobby.
say that's a bad deal.
Right.
So that gets back to...
And Netanyahu says it's a bad deal, but the Israeli intelligence community tells Netanyahu not that it's working, that it's a good deal right now, that it's so far it's working.
Well, I think Netanyahu is a disaster.
I agree. He's a reactionary.
As soon as he resigns, the better be for peace.
I agree. I think that it's kind of scary, the idea of him working with Trump. What I can't figure out is how Trump is going to balance the Netanyahu interests with his friends in Russia.
Now say that again, slower.
Well, would you?
You're talking about the pretend we're in Israel and you're Netanyahu. What's the question of why is Netanyahu behaving the way he is? What are you trying to say?
Why is he cozying up to the Trump administration?
Yeah, why?
Well, I think because, well, first he's going to be able to expand his settlements, which he's already beginning to do again.
Trump says, go ahead.
Yeah, Trump is allowing him to expand his settlements. So that's the first thing.
Right.
What I can't figure out is how, obviously there's no love lost between Netanyahu and Iran. But Iran is an ally of Russia in many respects.
Right.
So how is Trump going to play this game where he's both appeasing Netanyahu and maintaining friendly-ish terms with Russia?
I don't think
by proxy Iran.
I don't think you know, and I know what Trump really believes.
Yeah. No, I certainly don't know.
But I think that Netanyahu's interest is take care of the Palestinians first. Iran is a secondary consideration.
Okay. Yeah.
That's remote.
Right.
Iranian people are Indo-European. They're not Arabs.
Right.
So the first enemy,
they're Persian.
Yeah,
right.
the first enemy is the one on your doorstep, namely Palestinians. And Netanyahu encouraged the Obama administration and the Democratic Party to support a civil war in Syria to weaken Syria.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if If the Russians and the Turks solve that problem, that solves the problem for the United States. The United States Trump administration can get out of Syria.
Right.
Say, okay, in other words, they can say, okay, we've lost. Not Kazakhstan, but Kurdistan.
Well, that's what
Kurdistan is a lost cause.
I was about to bring up because that makes me worry about the future of the Kurds. If Turkey is
they're
going to
be repressed
on a deal,
by the Turks. The Turks win, and the Turks get Kurdistan.
Well, I think that's a shameful moral abdication of our duty.
You're playing Monopoly.
Kurds.
You can't win all of the cards. You have to.
I know.
You have to sell Boardwalk in order to save 3 greens, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and so forth.
I just think
Otherwise, you're going to lose the game.
I think that if there is any...
The world capitalism is not going to win. You can be assured of that.
I think it would be a shame to abandon the Kurds at this point.
Okay, that's a sentimental attitude.
It is.
You don't want to abandon the blacks. But
No.
Trump is abandoning the blacks. He's saying blacks get lost. I'm just going to cut your income, that's all.
I think that it would be a travesty to see the Kurds taken out.
It's a travesty to your conscience.
It is.
Okay.
Because of what our intervention, the American interventionism in the region has done to the Kurds and the situation that put them in. And to now leave them high and dry, I think would
Yeah, but that was the disaster
create
of
another situation like
George
Afghanistan.
W. Bush is responsible for that.
Leaving the Afghans high and dry.
He's
in
the
80s.
one who intervened in Iraq. And he went in there for oil.
Oh, I know. I was against it. And I was against that.
So the Kurdistan is just like the Shia and the Sunni. 3 different parties. They've all been victims of American imperialism.
Right. I agree.
So if you take the money away, leave it to the Turks, the Americans are off the hook. And then the future wars are going to be between Muslim states. The Turks and the Iranians are going to fight it out.
Yeah.
And the Iranians, and that's what the United States tried to do with Iraq and Iran. They tried to keep that balance of power going and let them kill one another, and that'll leave Israel safe. Well, that policy in the long run fails. It'll work 6 months, maybe a year, and Israel has been perking along. What is it, 8 Arab-Israeli wars?
Right.
They can win the next one as long as the United States keeps putting in the money.
Yeah, which we do.
Right.
Billions each year.
Yes, but is Trump going to last for 4 years or 2 years?
I have no idea.
Yeah, okay. Well, I believe in democracy, but democracy begins at home with the American voters. And the United States cannot impose democracy on Vietnam or any Middle East states. There's no.
I was no fan of the Bush doctrine.
Right, okay.
I didn't think that we were going to bring democracy to the Middle East.
Okay, so the idea of an independent Kurdistan was just one more American intervention by its incompetent implementation of imperialism.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry for the Kurds, but the Kurds have always been victims of the Turks, the Syrians, and the Iranians, 3 of them.
Yeah.
And there's never been an independent Kurdistan. It's a nice dream,
Yeah.
but I can't. Don't want to sacrifice my grandson for the independence of Kurdistan against the Middle East big powers.
I understand that.
Okay.
I think, but to me, it just leaves me with a really bad conscience.
Well, you have a bad conscience on that. Anyway, where we are on this outline here. You don't want to say anything more about Kissinger and Trump. It's unknown.
Yeah, so we can.
I'm up to page 7 here now. I'm just looking at the outline.
Okay. So
now I've been touching on this Israeli problem here. I'm going down to point 31 on page 8.
Scoop Jackson.
In addition to Kissinger's critique of the Democratic Party He also clashed with the neoconservatives. Democratic Senator Henry Scoop Jackson from the state of Washington advocated possible nuclear warfare. So those are the Democratic hawks that are a
Right.
problem. In 1970, Jackson, a well-known hawk, pushed the Nixon administration to adopt sanctions against the Soviet Union in order to liberate Soviet Jewish dissidents from the USSR. And it worked because in those days the United States had overwhelming power and the USSR was in disintegration.
Mm-hmm.
Now the USSR is a lot smaller, but the new Putin administration has more flexibility in the new balance of power because the United States is now one of three or four. It's no longer number one and only. It's no longer the only superpower.
No.
Okay, so the United States has to play politics with Germany and European Union and with the Middle East, wherever they go, and they're badly divided. They hope to back up the Egyptians and the Saudis, but that depends on oil. That depends on Tillerson. So there's a possibility of working with Egyptians and Saudis, but the Muslim states are getting tired of being sacrificed for Israel's interests. And the United States is losing its friends among the Middle East countries.
It is.
That's the pessimistic future. Okay.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Middle East is
Up
it's
for
already
grabs.
burning,
Up for grabs.
and we have proxy wars going on in Yemen and Syria. Well, there are proxy wars in Yemen and Syria between
Well, it looks
Shiite
like-
Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia
It looks like Trump is.
that could very well erupt at any time.
It looks like Trump and the oil powers are going to let Syria go.
Yeah, they're going to let Russia and Turkey and Iran,
At least that stops the immigration policy. That'll satisfy the Germans.
with regard to the refugees.
Yeah, what are they going
Yeah.
to do? The refugees will stop. And maybe the Syrians will come back to Syria.
Yeah, those 11 million.
But Syria will be like Iraq. It'll be an enemy of the United States. Well, we have to stop now. We didn't get as far as we had hoped, but anyway, we'll have to end our discussion here at this point. And we've been debating the unknown future of Trump and what he can learn from Henry Kissinger. And nobody knows the future. And I think that's enough for today. Anyway,
Yes.
keep the debate going. This is called, the program is called Debate is the Oxygen of Democracy. And I hope that you as a journalist keep this debate going, but I would like to drop out for a while, at least 100 days before I have my weapons realigned for a possible Democratic win for the Senate. That's my next objection. A Democratic win for the Senate in 2018, and we as Democrats should be planning for a comeback in 2018 over the objections of Trump. That's my opinion.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think that campaign has to start today.
Good.
Thank you very much, Professor.